Okay, so we are recording. So thank you everybody for coming to webinar for higher order questions in the digital landscape. I'm Samantha Bonham, a doctoral candidate at NGCU. And so we're going to look at some of the ideas behind developing higher order questioning, and we'll get started. So I'm going to share my screen, and let's just see if I can get this to work correctly. All right, can you guys see my screen? I'm not hearing anybody. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. I was like, wait a minute. I can't. I'm not seeing anybody. So I just want to make sure that you guys can see. All right. So we can see, correct? Just verbal. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we're going to start with the ideas of what today's session goals are. And really, I wanted to outline 5 major concepts for today and identifying really what questioning is and the purpose for questioning. So as we're working in the landscape today, we're seeing a shift into our online instruction that is kind of like info dumping. So we need to go back to the drawing board and identify what questioning is and its purpose, and be able to delineate between higher order and lower order questions, and recognize the role that instructional design, particularly for digital environments, plays in the creation of questions that will help to target the needs of learners and meet all the learning objectives that have been set for students. And then also we need to look at evaluating how the teacher mindset and our expectations for students, especially now that we've shifted to virtual learning, will impact students' critical thinking. And then finally, to analyze some digital resources that I've used with efficacy and efficiency in an online format to employ as engagement and discussion strategies to encourage higher order thinking in students. So to start, I wanted to define really what is questioning. And so questioning is meant as a way to encourage engagement and to discuss with students, not at just the surface level, but also to dig deeper with higher order. And that's where we get students to move from just behavioral questions where we can see that they're able to perform a task and move to cognitive levels that offer more complexity, such as problem solving and creativity. And so I want to start with this brief video. It's a little dated by Carl Sagan, but it's excellent. He brings up a wonderful point. So we'll start with this short clip.
My experience is you go talk to kindergarten kids or first grade kids, you find a class full of science enthusiasts. And they ask deep questions. What is a dream? Why do we have toes? Why is the moon round? What's the birthday of the world? Why is grass green? These are profound, important questions. They just bubble right out of them. You go and talk to 12th grade students, and there's none of that. They've become leaden and incurious. Something terrible has happened between kindergarten and 12th grade, and it's not just puberty.
And you're a nerd if you love science in the 12th grade, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, and so although this is focused on the content area of science, I'm gonna just see who we have here and let them in. Although we have, our focus predominantly on a science content, really what we need to focus on here is the bigger question of not what's going on with the students, but why the students disengage, and what this ultimately does for us as teachers in terms of our expectations that we're asking or setting of them. So is it the teachers that have changed, or is it the students that have changed? And I hear this argument all the time, and we've seen this debated in many forums online, and essentially it's both. Our environments have now been forced to change. And so just how we as educators in various settings are posing questions of students in digital environments, we need to think about that and how purposeful and how actionable our intentions are in these digital landscapes. And how are we ensuring that we use higher order questions with efficacy and efficiency in our digital formats during school closures? How you answer these questions is really a matter of how you're going to help your students meet objectives and work through activities and assessments. So let's take a look, right? We've all been here. And so, you know, we see an example of our expectations that we set for students. And now these questions are being asked of students from age ranges from elementary all the way up to higher education. And they're funny, but we look at such a simple lower order question, and if you can see what the students are responding with, it's actually pretty creative. So one of my favorites here is hard and soft water in the bottom corner. Briefly explain what that hard water is. It's ice. And then in the shapes above it, name the quadrilateral. And we have so affectionately named Bob and Sam and Harry and so forth. And so we've been asking students with low expectations to kind of turn around and circumvent our low level growth and like mindset for them, in a sense, to then develop all of a sudden this critical thinking that's more cognitively complex. And now we've got this. So in our environments today, this is actually a picture I took of a first grader's lesson that was posted to a classroom. And so, you know, when you look at something like this today, it's kind of upsetting to see that this is what essentially we've been asking students to do, is move from our really lovely higher order questions that we want them to accomplish and get them to be so scripted like this. And the idea is that we need to move from knowledgeable, right, to knowledge able. And we do that through higher order questioning strategies and our landscapes that help move learners from these low level expectations to help them focus on knowledge, to be able to create and use this in unique ways to solve problems. And there's a global relevance now more than ever as we're facing this crisis with the pandemic. And so essentially good questions will lead people on a quest. And we need to move our students from this idea, like I had mentioned, knowledgeable to knowledge able. And higher order questions, the use of technology, allow students to connect, organize, share, collect, collaborate, publish, all of these things that we're asking our students to do, not only to meet state standards, but also to address 21st century skills. And this is using thinking, such as analysis, evaluation, prediction, synthesis. And they're doing this to learn new information on their own and become meaning seekers. And when they do that, essentially we're shifting their focus here in how they respond to us and to the information that they're presented. And in doing so, we're helping teachers understand through this instructional shift and this mindset from face-to-face instruction that it's not cheating if they're working together, right? It's creating. And so we've had teachers post things online. You might have seen this somewhere in your professional learning networks. You know, what do I do? My students are going to cheat. Well, that means that our expectation of them is low, and the activities that go in line with that, right, are also low. And we need to shift our own mindset in order to be able to define, right, what these questions are, how we're going to get them from point A to point B. And so lower order versus higher order. And so here I want to discern the difference between two types of questions. And I really want to stop and focus on the fact that lower order questions have become prevalent in many of our online courses today. And the reason for that is not because teachers are lazy, but conversely, right, teachers are overwhelmed, right? Many of them are struggling to grasp almost overnight new pedagogical practices that are using digital mediums in a completely new environment, such as fully online courses. And they may have never had to do this, whether they're synchronous or asynchronous. But understanding the context in which our students are learning help us better frame questions and also just how to ask these questions. So we know that lower order and higher order, right, have differences. And one of the fundamental hallmarks of lower order questions is that we just want to see if students can follow specific directions. Do you understand what I'm asking of you? And then higher order involves, well, why would someone do this? And what are the reasons for that? Is there ever a just war, right? And these are questions that are open-ended, that spur additional discussion amongst students as they're progressing. through lessons. So I'm gonna just stop 1 second. I apologize. Try to let in a few people. And yes, I saw a question. Will I be able to share the presentation? And I will be able to do that once this is all over. I'll share this with you. So I want to address principles of instructional design, right? So how do we move from lower order to higher order in online environments? And so if for those of you that have, obviously understand principles of instructional design, but some people, as particularly some educators, have never seen this. And this is based on research from Merrill and Gagne. And teachers generally follow this, whether they know of Gagne or not, in his 9 events of instruction. Is we set learning objectives, we get students' attention, we hook them in a lesson, we move from where they are in a present level of performance in a behavioral sense, which tends to be lower level, right? Because we're focusing on recall, remembering, things like that. And then we're trying to move them to more cognitively challenging questions that demand more of them, such as to create something or to develop something. And this is where our questioning strategies are interconnected to our instructional design. Behavioral approaches particularly tend to be aligned with more lower order thinking. And when we increase on this scale or this hierarchy, we allow for higher order thinking to develop, where students can then become problem solvers. And eventually what's needed is problem finders. And I believe that that's needed at this higher echelon of the cognitive domain, because we can no longer give pseudo problems to students that they have to solve, right? We need students to go out in today's environment, particularly in our globalized, connected society, and say, these are problems that are probably going to present themselves. We need to identify these so we can start to develop solutions now. And this is where it's important to delineate the connection, right, between higher order questioning and essential questions. And for all of those that are saying, well, wait a minute, right? We need to meet students' needs first. Well, this is based on the adage, we need to Maslow before we can bloom. We have to understand that students have behaviors that need to be set up in terms of procedure of how to work online accordingly in order to get them to move to higher levels of cognitive complexity in an online digital environment. And that starts with us as the educator. And so we have our favorite idea here of pedagogy first, technology next. I'm going to pause just one more moment. I apologize. I'm going to admit a couple people that are trying to jump in here. Okay, go back to the presentation. I apologize. And so when we look at essential questions, enduring understandings, and curriculum content, we look at how important it is to note that essential questions are independent of, but correlated to higher order thinking questions. And essential questions, according to research that has been conducted by McTighe and Wiggins, which were 2 educational theorists that are responsible for something very popular called understanding by design, which teachers commonly know in K-12 as backwards design, that are fundamental to opening the doors to student understanding. They're open-ended, they're thought-provoking, they require higher order thinking, they point toward big transferable ideas, so we can tell students that they're connected from how can we connect this subject to that, right? We see the interconnectivity. They raise additional questions, and they require students to have justification, and they recur over time. It's not just a wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, right? What ended in 1895, as we saw on the first slide, and then the students so aptly put 1896, right? For, as what ended in 1895, well, 1894, and then 1896 began. So we can't just ask these questions of students and not think that they'll recur over time. We need students to understand that essential questions promote inquiry, and that it lets students know that these questions are pivotal to the learning process. We're not trying to inundate, and we're not trying to tell students that we're just going to keep them busy while they're online. That these questions are going to be focused, purposeful, intentional to help them get to where we need them to be. And just so, how can we get these students then to move toward cognitive complexity in digital environments, right? This is the big money question. And so we must recognize the context for framing questions involves our pedagogical choices, our own understanding of the content in which we teach students, and the specific intentional selection of technology that we use to engage students. So I'm going to stop right here and ask if anybody has any questions about what I've discussed so far. If there's any questions or anybody want to jump in, you can unmute yourself, and if anybody has anything. If not, I'm going to keep on going. Okay. So how we do this is the TPAC framework. And this was, for most of us that are in educational technology, we recognize Mishra and Kohler's framework. But for those of you that are not familiar, this framework is the technological pedagogical content knowledge framework. And it's an intrinsic part of instructional design, specifically questioning. It's not what we want students to know, but it's how we frame our approach. And essentially, this is particularly true for formative assessments, which are crucial to students in digital formats in order to demonstrate their understanding, reflective knowledge, and questioning is central to both formative and summative assessments. And so when you're looking at how you're going to ask students what they know, how we approach that is really important. And we need to blend our choices of how we approach tasks, our content knowledge of what we want students to know and our student learning objectives, and also the technology has to match and marry. And so higher order question strategies, right, essentially they scaffold students. And in online environments, we cannot take for granted that students just get it, right? And I've heard this repeated as a common theme, that we can't assume that our students have more technical skills than they actually do. We no longer have physical cues and body language that us as educators so saliently relied on in the classroom, right? As we walked around and kind of read the room, right, so to speak. We are going to do this scaffolding now in a digital landscape through our careful consideration of learning objectives that we set for the students, the activities that we're asking them to complete, which should be performance-based if we're working in online formats, and the technology we choose, because it will help students enhance engagement and systematically move them toward reaching objectives. And when we do this, it helps to address questions that teachers are asking when we shift to online learning, such as, you know, what can I do to prevent students from cheating? And I mentioned this earlier, right? This idea that teachers are asking this. And the idea here is that students should be interacting with their peers on activities that essentially foster collaboration and encourage discussion through inquiry-based experiential activities. An application of skills and synthesis of understanding is key. And when we should shift our mindsets from worrying about, you know, why are they cheating or what are they going to do to cheat, to what are the best ways to elicit engagement with purposeful questioning in digital formats? And that just shows that we aren't asking the right questions when we ask about them cheating. And we need to be mindful of the context that our students are now in. Our expectations of students, therefore, must change. And so when we look at our expectations, we all depend on Bloom's taxonomy. We do this in a face-to-face and also in a digital environment. And so to move students from lower levels of thinking to more complex cognitive domains that would encompass higher order level questions, we use Bloom's taxonomy. And this is what we've learned in teacher prep programs. This is what we spent countless hours and PD sessions on in schools with colleagues and administrators, right? And we try to align, you know, what's in our curriculum to Bloom's. But that shifts now in Bloom's digital taxonomy. And much like the TPAC model that I showed earlier from Mishra and Kohler, right, which suggested that we have to, as educators, be cognizant of the tech tools that are available to us and our students that will help them engage with their peers. That is essentially important to develop critical thinkers, right? And so if we look at how we move along this level of higher order thinking skills, right, what we're doing with our digital tech should align to what we're asking students to do. And so what are some digital resources that can help students pose questions and answer them? And this is the big money question that I've been asked by many people and have had many discussions with some of my own students and working with them online. And so essentially, I give my students student choice boards. Whether they are K-12 or they are higher education, it is essential that you provide students the flexibility and the opportunity to move along this taxonomy that Bloom has outlined for us by providing students choice. And we do so by also incorporating Gardner's multiple intelligence model by letting students play to their strengths. So if I ask students a question and I post it on a discussion forum, I give them multiple avenues to respond to my query. They can go to some of these activities and some of these platforms that I've listed here. And some of you may recognize some of these, but I've actually incorporated a few that you may not have heard of before. On Hangouts is one of my favorite student choice boards that my students absolutely love. I used this effectively in K-12 without any issue. And there was no problems with security here because students are creating their digital environment with their students and their peers. It's an open source platform. They will be booted out. It does run off of artificial intelligence. If there are any inappropriate words or text that have been picked up by the AI, especially if it's set for K-12. And if there's images that are dropped on a whiteboard, because there's an opportunity for students to use a digital whiteboard with each other in real time as they're doing this on Hangout, it'll actually boot them out and it screen captures things to send to the instructor. So in a K-12 environment, on Hangouts has been wildly popular. And I've used this with efficacy as well, as I've mentioned, in higher education, as students do breakouts with each other and when they work in groups particularly. Parlay is another one that you may or may not have heard of. And Parlay is a free application where you can poll students and get them to engage in real time. Parlay essentially acts like Flipgrid, it acts like ThingLink, and it acts like Padlet in one, as well as a polling tool. It is incredibly popular with students in both higher ed and K-12, and it's really easy to use. I'd like to also let you guys know that all of these tools that I've included here are free. And you don't have to pay anything. And they've always been free, even before schools have closed due to the pandemic. So now a lot of these applications have offered free premium features as well, if you're interested. But again, all of these have always been offered without charge. And so another one that students have loved to use incorporates both text, video, audio, all kinds of different opportunities for multimedia is ThingLink. Students really love this. It's easy to use, and I've seen some really incredible responses from students that have initially been reticent, particularly students with limited English proficiency and working online. Even in adult learners, they prefer things like ThingLink or online voice recorders where they can record themselves speaking, because as we know, for students or individuals that are working to learn another language, when they're able to speak, that tends to come first before the written language. So it is more freeing for them and less anxiety and provoking for them to be able to still participate, but not feel like their voice is not being amplified enough because of language barriers. And so I've used that. I've used Screencastify, where students can create a screen of like a one slide PowerPoint, and they can work off of that PowerPoint and it records their screen and their voice, or they can actually record themselves speaking and make a video to send. Flipgrid is another common one where you post a question and it's video responses, or even social media. So I've had teachers tell me, even in elementary school, they're going live on like an Instagram live, and they're doing their morning meetings with elementary school students The parents are logging in through their social media. They're just, able to send like a heart or a hello in the chat box. And the teachers are running through morning circle time. The kids are sending hearts. The teachers are looking at who's logging in online as the parents are coming in to type their student's name, and the teachers are calling the students out by name saying, hello, good morning, how are you? And even in Twitter for your older students to engage through hashtags and also Twitter chats or even professional learning networks. Anchor is one that I've just recently started using, and Anchor is a podcast tool. It's basically Flipgrid, but audio only. And it is a podcast in 2 minutes. You need absolutely no software. It is compatible with almost every single device that exists on any platform. It is absolutely free, and students can create 2-minute podcast snippets and send back and forth to each other. So it is like an audio Flipgrid, which is very fun. And I've seen students then say, I'm hooked on this. I'm actually starting my own podcast, and they can actually syndicate podcasts on any topic of their choice. And it's absolutely free, and it'll publish to Google Podcasts or Apple Podcasts without any cost to the student. And so Socrative is another one that I've also used, and that has been more recent because it provides real-time data. So if I'm asking students to do check-ins with me and I post something and they're not sure about it, this is where it is a lower level questioning strategy tool with a mix of my higher order questioning strategies and my resources, because I don't want to just overwhelm students. So Socrative allows me to be able to just do quick checks with multiple choice. I can use built-in templates right away, and students can, much like on their cell phone, it'll pop up if they go on Socrative and they enter in, they press a button, and it lets me know in real time, do I need to go back over something? Do I need to provide another modality in which students can be successful? And it provides me that just-in-time feedback without having to wait, even if I'm in an asynchronous environment. Socrative has been extremely instrumental in allowing me to be able to understand what my students are struggling with, so I can then curtail what I'm giving them and help modify, even in my online environment, what they're seeing. DrawChat is my #1 favorite thing. I recommend that you take a look at DrawChat. DrawChat is a whiteboard that's absolutely free. It'll transcribe what you're drawing. It'll actually capture what students are putting down. It is wonderful for people that are more visual in nature. You can add online voice recorder tools over DrawChat to make digital stories. I've seen professional artists use this with applications such as Adobe, and computer software teachers are using this to teach code. And I've seen this all the way down to elementary school, where students are, using fine motor coordination for students with exceptionalities. A teacher has the word cat, and they've dropped in their voice saying the word cat, and students are asked to drag and drop selected images or parts of a cat into the correct order, so it helps them work with fine motor coordination, and they're doing this in real time. I absolutely love DrawChat. It's completely free, and I highly recommend you take a look at this. And then the last two I have here at the bottom are Create a Forum. So Tap a Talk and Forum Motion are more for your older students, and this is where they can create their own online learning environment or their own digital environment. And they can do this by creating forums like a mini LinkedIn based on topics or based on content that they're seeing, or they can do group work together in this. There's many filter options for students to prevent them from, again, being hacked by anybody or working with any explicit content. It does have filters for that. And it's absolutely free, and it's very easy to use. Students can create discussion forums outside of, say, Blackboard or your LMS, and they can engage by dropping in any other media tool that they want. So if Blackboard or Schoology or Moodle or your Google Classroom limits students from being able to add a response from, say, Parlay, they can do that with Forum Motion. They can develop their own forum, and they can drop in any other tools of their choice to be able to respond or to show and demonstrate what they know. So I'm going to stop right here and ask if anybody has any questions in regards to some of the tools that I went over. And I just wanted to see how everybody's doing, if there's any questions. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so seems like everybody's doing okay. And so I'm going to get ready to wrap up in the last portion to address one of my final objectives for the session, which is some tips on how to use higher order questioning. And so we're going to take a look at this, and we'll get ready to wrap up, and I'll answer any other questions that remain if you have any. So some tips for using higher order questions with online instruction. So a couple of the things that I found important for me as a teacher in an online environment now is to encourage free thinking in your students. Regardless of how old they are and regardless of what content that you're working with, give students choice. Allow them multiple formats to engage with you. Even if you're working in an environment where you're posting a question, allow them the freedom to express themselves in the medium that works for them. You will be very surprised that oftentimes when given that opportunity, students will go above and beyond in what they provide to you. Use divergent questions, right, to tap into previously learned knowledge. Use convergent questions to create connections, and ask students to explore the responses and those of their peers. Now, it is important to remember that the online learning environment flourishes when instruction moves from a teacher-centered approach to a learner-centered approach. Regardless of whatever choices you have provided to your students to ask them questions to spur engagement and inquiry, higher order questioning in a digital landscape requires a sincere commitment to a shift in mindset by the teacher and the student alike. And with this shift, students cooperate and collaborate with other students and even the teacher on assignments. However, it's important, and this is the most, I think, important thing for me to, again, stress, is don't info dump on your students with a barrage of content and then expect students to make sense of their higher order questions or to even give you anything higher order in return. Remember, the best questions are those that are clearly designed to align to performance outcomes using innovative instructional design. It helps when students see exemplars of good work in a classroom, and then therefore it also benefits learners to see examples and samples of how to respond to questions using the format you've presented to them to demonstrate that method as well. So it makes sense if you're going to give students an exemplar of what you're seeing as, quote, good work, it makes sense to do the same for the questions that you're asking of them and also with the tool that you're giving them to use. And also when you're looking at creating course materials that contain questions or even formative or summative assessments in digital landscapes, make sure that you're creating materials that motivate students extrinsically and intrinsically by using sensory stimuli, such as aesthetically pleasing, fun digital resources that garner student attention and stimulate their intellectual curiosity. In doing so, we understand Gardner's multiple intelligences comes into play here, and it concerns different types of learners, such as auditory, visual, or spatial learners. And we as teachers now in this environment need to leverage digital platforms that offer these benefits to students, not only to help them make content easier to understand, but to allow them to reinforce learning outcomes to mix it up. And so to end and to prove a little bit of my point here, I just want to show a quick lesson that was done in one of my favorite movies that I've used to teach on this topic of developing questioning, from Mona Lisa Smile. So I'll show you just a couple minutes of this clip.
Fear. Good morning. Thank you. This is History of Art 100. We'll be following Dr. Staunton's syllabus. Any questions so far?
Your name?
Why don't you go first?
Connie Baker.
Catherine Watson, nice to meet you.
Dr. Watson, I presume.
Not yet. And you are?
Giselle Levy.
Giselle. If someone could get the...
Susan Delacourt.
Thank you, Susan Delacourt. From the beginning, man has always had the impulse to create art. Can anyone tell me what this is?
Wounded Bison, Altamira, Spain, about 15,000 BC. Joan Brandwin.
Very good, Joan. Despite the age of these paintings, they are technically very sophisticated.
Because of the shading and the thickness of the lines as it moves over the hump of the bison. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Next slide. This one you are probably less familiar with. It was discovered by archaeologists in
1879, Lascaux, France, dates back to 10,000 BC, singled out because of the flowing lines depicting the movement of the animal.
Impressive name.
Herd of horses.
I meant yours.
We call her Flicka. Elizabeth Warren. They call me Betty.
Very good. Betty is also correct. Just because something is ancient doesn't mean that it is primitive. For example, next slide, please.
My Serenis and his queen, 2470 BC. It's a funerary statue of the pharaoh and his queen, originally intended to preserve the pharaoh's soul.
Have any of you taken art history before?
No.
Let's go on slide.
Seated scribe, Egypt, 2400 BC. Peasant couple plowing, 16th century BC, Egypt. Snake goddess, Minoan, 1600 BC. Victoria Bell fresco, Minoan, 1600 BC. Funeral mass, Masnayan, Tuapia.
So I'm going to stop here and ask you guys to consider, right? We've seen this in a face-to-face environment, but have you also seen this online too, where our expectations of our students are not exceptionally high? So in this clip, what expectations did she have of the students, and how deeply did they need to understand the material in order to meet her expectations? So I'm going to stop and see if we can get you guys to jump in. Any thoughts? I think you're talking, Judith, but I can't hear you. Okay. So I'm not sure, I can't hear you. I think it sounds like you're saying something, but I'm not able to hear you. But when we look back at how she framed her questions with the students, essentially they weren't higher order whatsoever. She had low expectations of the students on a more behavioral level, and she thought that students may not have understood. So she started out with base level questioning and expected the students to follow suit. But let's see how she shifts her focus here, because the expectation changes.
What is that?
You tell me. Carcass by Soutine, 1925.
It's not on the syllabus.
No, it's not. Is it any good? Come on, ladies. There's no wrong answer. There's also no textbook telling you what to think. It's not that easy, is it?
All right, no, it's not good. In fact, I wouldn't even call it art. It's grotesque.
Is there a rule against art being grotesque? I think there's something aggressive about it. And erotic.
To you, everything is erotic. Everything is erotic. Girls.
Aren't there standards?
Of course there are.
Otherwise, a tacky velvet painting could be equated to a Rembrandt.
Hey, my Uncle Freddie has 2 tacky velvet paintings. He loves those clowns.
There are standards, technique, composition, color, even subject. So if you're suggesting that rotted side of meat is art, much less good art, then what are we going to learn?
Just that. You have outlined our new syllabus, Betty. Thank you. What is art? What makes it good or bad, and who decides? Next slide, please. 25 years ago, someone thought this was brilliant.
I can see that.
Who? My mother. I painted it for her birthday. Next slide. This is my mom. Is it art?
It's a snapshot.
If I told you Ansel Adams had taken it, would that make a difference?
Art isn't art until someone says it is.
It's art.
The right people?
Who are they?
Betty Warren. We're so lucky we have one of them right here.
Could you go back to this routine?
So in this, we see that the expectations changed, right? She no longer just relied on closed-ended questions that had a simple set of expected answers. She encouraged the students to engage with one another by purposely leaving her questions open-ended, and she wanted to spur discussion, and she got it. And the students were deeply engaged with the material because they didn't understand what it was, and they were working together collaboratively to be able to uncover meaning. And so the goal is, as we wrap up our session, is to move students from recall and opinion toward a synthesis and justification that's rooted in evidence, real-world relevance, and their personal experience. And the idea, again, for higher order thinking is to allow students to develop divergent thinking to become problem finders. So thank you very much for attending my session. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if anybody has any questions or they need anything in regards to how you could develop questions or have any thing that you want to discuss. All right, it sounds like everybody is good. So I want to thank you all for attending the session today, and I'm going to make the PowerPoint available through the webinar online through the department website, and you'll see that posted there. I've provided at the very beginning of the session a link to New Jersey City University's EdTech events and a link to where you can find all the webinars, and you'll be able to find this information as well, and that way you guys have access to this. And I really appreciate that you guys coming, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye. Thank you.